Hello and welcome back to Web Components Remote Conference. I'm Justin Barrow, taking over for Leon for the afternoon. And let's move on to our next speaker, whose name I'm probably going to mispronounce because, as everybody knows from the podcast, I mispronounce everything. So our next speaker is going to talk about why you'll probably never author web components, and that's okay. And please welcome Raphaël Rougeron. And you're going to correct that because it's horrible, and I'm going to get out of the way. I hear you all laugh.
It's Raphaël Rougeron. Hi, everybody. The less we can say about web components is it's been a long ride because, well, it all started 5 years ago with Alex Russell talking about web components and model-driven views at the Frontiers conference in October 2011. Then a few months later, we got the introduction to web components. And my reaction to this draft was I was ecstatic, and to understand why I have to talk a bit about myself, or more precisely about what I was working on at that time. In 2011, I took a job at a company that wanted to build modern web applications for financial services. I was tasked to recruit a team and to start building applications. At that time, I was pretty sure that single-page applications were the future. And so we started to explore our stack options. We did it very seriously, testing every major library of the time. And we finally chose YUI. You may not remember what YUI was, but it was a library from Yahoo. And it may sound strange now that we made that choice, but UI offered something that Backbone, for instance, missed completely. That is a sound UI toolkit. Here, you can see an example of YUI code. As you may guess, it's related to tabs. As you can see, it's pure imperative code, which in my opinion is bad for UI code because it's hard when you read that kind of code to guess how it will look. Like Jordan, remember us yesterday, the declarative nature of HTML makes it really easy to read and to visualize the parent-child relationship, of the tags, but I digress. So we use some of YUI components. We build our own components too with YUI. And we also used Bootstrap to save some time, or so we thought. Bootstrap allowed us to build something quickly that looked good. The problem with Bootstrap is that you need to copy and paste huge chunks of HTML to make it work. It looks a bit like copy and paste programming, and customizing the styles is far from easy. So we built our first application with YUI, and quite frankly, our code was a mess, a total mess. We felt we needed something more MVC oriented, so for the next project, we tried Ember. With Ember, we discovered new ways of integrating UI components into our code. We use some jQuery UI components, and well, you see, this is the way we did it. We used the did insert element callback of Ember to plug our jQuery UI code. And it works, of course, but it's far from being elegant. I think this is what we could call a leaky abstraction. Now, you're probably thinking that this new project with Ember didn't end well, and you're not far from the reality. Ember was pretty new at that time, and when our app was loaded with production data, we found that we had pretty serious performance issues. Well, long story short, I stayed 5 years at this company, and during these 5 years, we fell victim to what I like to call the syndrome of the change of stack. Oh, sorry, I missed one slide. So I don't know for you, but I personally used 6 different stacks in 5 years. And with that syndrome of the change of stack, there is an annoying side effect. That is the necessity of rewriting our UI components with each change of stack. Because of course, components you build with Angular won't be usable with your next React project. They are not interoperable. And it's not just a minor annoyance. Of course, it all depends on what kind of application you're building. And I mean application, not website. But these days, when you're building complex applications, you need a lot of UI components. You need tabs, calendars, sliders, data grids, overlays. You need to support drag and drop, and so on. So that's why I was so ecstatic when I saw this introduction to web components for the first time. Finally, here was a solution to my problems. Here was a way to build UI components one time and to reuse them no matter of the framework you're using. That's the reason I created Bosonic 3 years ago. I felt like Polymer was too feature-rich for my tests, and since my previous experience with Ember, I tend to dislike two-way data binding. And what I wanted to do was to write vanilla web components with a syntax close to the original introduction to web components. That is, something that looked like that. And this is what the first version of Bosonic did. I worked really hard on Bosonic. I tried different ways of doing things. I even tried to transpile web components into already polyfilled JS and CSS files. And I was so convinced developers would love web components. It made so much sense to me. And yet, here we are, 3 years later, and when you're talking about web components, the average reaction of a typical developer is this: meh. They didn't get it. The least we can say is that web components are far from being adopted by all developers. When you look at Google Trends, and yes, I know it's a bit silly to do that, but still, well, it speaks for itself. Of course, there is a lot of queries related to Polymer. but web components next to 0. Okay, no, I think things are changing. People are becoming more and more informed, and some begin to grasp what web components are and why they are useful. But for 3 years, I often had the sensation of being a lone voice in the dark. It has been really frustrating because I had difficulties to understand why this rejection. I think developers got the message wrong. Some developers got the impression that web components were proposed as a replacement for frameworks, that from now they should build their apps using only web components, which is obviously false, because comparing web components versus Angular or React is totally like comparing apples versus oranges. But still, I met people year after year that had this vision of web components. And in a sense, it's perfectly understandable. The thing is, the introduction to web components was brilliant. It was clear, it was simple, but it got retired when the battle for standardization began. And we got 4 drafts instead. And one of these drafts was for HTML templates. And when you look at this, you see the word template, which has a very precise meaning for developers. But here, there is no mustaches. There is no for loop tag. How can I inject my data into that template? How can I make lists of items? It's no wonder some developers may have been a bit disappointed by this. I also met people that think web components are polymer. So they think web components are just another framework. There are also developers whose opinion about web components have largely been influenced by the opinion of the creators of their favorite framework. For instance, I remember Ember developers said something like that they were looking forward to use web components into Ember. And consequently, developers think that web components is so low-level stuff that it should be used in framework internals only. Some high-profile developers, mainly in the React community, have also been extremely critical and vocal against web components for wrong reasons, of course. Fortunately, things have evolved, and the React community began recently to at least acknowledge the existence of web components. Like this, with a new page into React documentation. There is also another issue for some developers, that is browser support. It's right to say that it took a bit of time for the specifications to stabilize and for browser support to improve. That's why we have polyfills, but well, some developers were worried with the absence of inline support, for instance. Of course, it's definitely less the case now, but it was a problem for some, say, 2 years ago. Although seeing some browser vendors brag about web component specifications made developers doubtful about web components adoption. And finally, I met developers who said things like, if I need tabs, I can build a tabs component in React in 20 minutes. And I think it's probably the worst reason I heard. Because yes, building a very simple tabs component that looks like it does a job is very simple with React. You can do something like this. But is that component accessible? Nope. Does it support keyboard navigation? Nope. And what if you want to have a nice transition when switching tabs? There are so many things to think and reason about: performance, accessibility, appearance. You need to master the browser technologies, and it takes time to acquire that skill set. And applying that skill set takes a lot of time too, time you will not spend doing what your job as a developer is all about, building features. The reality is that building a complete UI component is really hard work. Jan, who is the next speaker, wrote something called the gold standard checklist for web components. It's an amazing work, an amazing document that shows well how much work is needed to build a good UI component. And it's not only for web components. This checklist can be applied to any UI component, regardless of the framework used to build that component. So we have developers that build half-baked components, and by doing that, they are solving already solved problems. Take the dialogue, for instance. It is a perfectly solved problem. We know how to make a dialogue. We know what its behavior should be. Regarding accessibility, everything is described in the area authoring practices. And more, there is even a dialogue element in Chrome already. This is a solved problem. And yet, there are probably hundreds of developers that write dialogues components every year. Fortunately, a lot of developers try to not reinvent the wheel when starting a new project. And like I did when I started at my previous company, they search for a UI toolkit compatible with their framework, or for individual components suiting their needs. And they have the choice. It's amazing how much of these toolkits you find these days. You find this, in this awesome lists, awesome React, awesome Angular. And what's a bit sad to me is that these toolkits all do the same thing that Bootstrap did and still do. Tabs, calendars, sliders, menus, dropdowns, and so on. So you should now see what the problem is to me. What HTML elements provide us with is insufficient for modern application development. There is a list of basic UI components that we absolutely need in our everyday job. And this is a problem web components could solve and should solve. But in my opinion, the community is not sufficiently engaged with web components for that problem to be solved. Now, what can we do? I think it's time to be a little more tactical. If developers doesn't want to write web components, so be it. But that doesn't mean they couldn't include web components in their projects. That's why I'm somewhat okay with talking about web components as Leaf nodes. Because that's an idea that began to make sense for some developers, at least in the React community. And I think that's how we could make web components succeed in the long haul. I know some people in our community are not fans of this idea. We heard a lot use the platform, and it's true. The platform is awesome. We have so much new fantastic APIs that allow us to build more and more powerful applications. But the platform is huge too. This list of features is one brilliant illustration of this. And let's face it, it's really hard to master the platform. It's low level, it's full of gotchas, it's a moving target. You may argue that's our job to master this platform. But remember that not every team has dedicated front-end developers. I know a lot of teams where developers are back-end developers that are asked to build single-page applications. They can't learn the platform in one day. That's why they look at frameworks like Angular, because they want something more batteries included. There is also in our world of lean startups and agile teams, what we could call a culture, a culture of quick prototyping. Things move fast, we need to be agile to deliver features, and there is often no time for quality or accessibility or mobile performance. It's sad, but it's a fact. We are often asked to write trashable code. One important thing I want to say is I'm not saying that you should never build an application using only web components. It's definitely possible, but it will not really be purely made of web components. We'll write some JavaScript glue code. So in my eyes, we are more talking about a vanilla JavaScript application. And again, it's perfectly doable, perhaps more for simple applications, because complex applications have a complex state. And the hard problem React, Angular, and so on are trying to solve is the propagation of state changes to DOM. That's the hard problem. And that's a problem web components don't solve. That's a tweet of Dana Bronoff that resumes the situation to me. For simple applications, you can probably do this propagation of state changes by hand, but with more complexity, you will probably end up to write your own framework. And I bet you will probably end up with web components as Leaf nodes too. Because I definitely think that's where web components apply well. One thing that led me to think this way is this. Here you see custom elements lifecycle callbacks. They are very important because they provide ways to do various things when elements are inserted into the DOM, like setting event listeners. They may look quite similar to React lifecycles method, by the way. You can see there is something similar. But the thing is, when with web components, you absolutely need these callbacks for dumb things. With React, the last thing you want to do is to use React lifecycle methods. The goal when you are using React, and more when you're using React with Redux, you want components as pure functions. Like this. No lifecycle methods. And you don't want to make the abstraction of React leak by doing dumb stuff into React lifecycle methods. That's why that's why I think React and others and web components are so complementary. Web components lifecycle callbacks are perfect for dealing with dumb side effects of the component state changes. There is another factor to consider. If web components are not tailored for building apps, you could think that it's still a way of building UI components that will be reusable regardless of the framework used for building your apps. But for UI components to be reusable without needing an enormous amount of configuration, you will need to stick to very atomic and stateless ones, unrelated to data, more than stateless, and that severely limits the number of reusable elements you can build. Moreover, even if some UI components may look similar from project to project, they are rarely exactly the same. After all, that's the main reason why we developers are so bad at making estimates. We lack metrics because we never build exactly the same thing twice. So I think there is a hard limit to UI elements reusability and to the number of elements we really need. So with that in mind, here is what I'm working on right now with Bosonic. I think we now have custom elements and Shadow DOM with a pretty good browser support. And we need to make web components work perfectly with React, Angular, and so on. So I think the first thing is to build simple custom elements without any Shadow DOM, and to use composition of these elements to build our complete components. Here is an example of what how we could build a menu by composing these small custom elements. Each of these custom elements serve a single purpose. Here, the menu button serves only to provide the toggle of the menu, and the list box is used here for navigation into the list and accessibility and so on. So with these basic small custom elements, we can easily build React components by using a small library which has been written by Trey during his work with Sketch.js. And here is how it looks. Here I use this function, Reactify, that does a very simple things. It wraps a web component into a React component, and it will convert React properties, props, into web components properties, and it will manage the custom events connection with React. So with this, we are perfectly able to provide React components based on web components. And a third thing we could do is to provide web components using Shadow DOM, like a menu web component for people that don't want to use React, but only web components. And finally, I have a sort of call to action. Or for action, never mind. I think we need a definitive library of UI web components, and I think we should work on this as a community. I think a community developed and curated library of UI components, think of Bootstrap on web components, is necessary. That's the goal I had with Bosonic, but in Cat B, it can be a one-man effort. So let's try to get together and to build that library so that we never have to another dialogue. Thank you for your attention, and if you have any questions.
Sorry about that. Technical difficulties as Justin tries to unfocus screens. Boom. Haha. Success. Raphael, thank you so much for a very fascinating talk. I mean, you've been on the web podcast before, and we've talked about Bosonic and a lot of sort of how components and web components work in the world. Do you see a lot more people sort of going towards this sort of hybrid approach in terms of UI web components today?
Not much yet. I think people need examples, success stories to begin to believe that this is possible to do.
So there's a lot of bigger sites starting to use sort of web components as a whole, and you start to see it. But I mean, in terms of frameworks, the frameworks have really started to come around towards, sort of that web components that are okay in our framework. Because I know there was, to your point in your talk, there was a lot of resistance to that initially, but now web components seem to play a lot better in the sort of the framework ecosystems.
Yeah, definitely. There was a lot of difficulties making React developers make React compatible with web components, but today there is definitely I don't know to say that, but there is a form of acceptance of web components are here and they are useful. And I think it's really important that story is that to have a full UI library, because it's probably what it will take for web components to succeed. I think it's my opinion.
Well, again, thank you very much for coming out and giving this talk.
Thank you.
We greatly appreciate it. For those watching this on the live stream, the next talk will start just here in a few minutes. So we will see you shortly.
Thank you.